Marlene Booker had worked inside the Bellamy family kitchens for 24 years, but on the night their restaurant empire celebrated its 100th anniversary, the youngest heir introduced her to a room full of investors with three careless words: "She's our servant." Laughter moved around the private dining room, not cruel enough to become a scandal, not loud enough for anyone to admit later, but clear enough for Marlene to hear from the kitchen doorway. She stood holding a silver tray of miniature crab cakes while Adrian Bellamy smiled beside his fiancée and accepted congratulations for rescuing the family company. At 32, Adrian had never developed a recipe, managed a dinner rush, or stayed after midnight when a refrigerator failed. Yet magazine profiles called him the new face of Bellamy Dining Group, a collection of 18 luxury restaurants built around the story of his great-grandfather, Ambrose Bellamy, a visionary chef who supposedly created the family's famous recipes from nothing. Marlene knew that story was incomplete. She also knew that correcting wealthy people in front of their guests usually cost more than silence. So she placed the tray on the table and said, "The crab cakes are ready." Adrian's fiancée, Penelope Shaw, glanced at Marlene's white chef's jacket. "I thought servants usually wore uniforms." Adrian laughed again. "Marlene likes pretending she runs the kitchen." Marlene looked at him. "Someone has to." The room went quiet for half a second. Adrian's older sister, Vivian Bellamy, stepped forward before he could answer. "Thank you, Marlene. You may return downstairs." Marlene did not move immediately. At the head of the table sat their father, Graham Bellamy, recovering from a stroke that had weakened his right side and made speech difficult. His eyes met hers. Shame appeared in them, but he said nothing. He had spent most of his life doing that, recognizing injustice and waiting for a more comfortable moment to confront it. Marlene gave him a small nod and returned to the kitchen. Bellamy Dining Group had begun with one narrow restaurant near the railway station in 1924. The public story said Ambrose Bellamy opened the place with $12, a cast-iron stove, and a gift for turning ordinary ingredients into elegant food. The original restaurant, Bellamy House, still operated in the same building, though marble counters and chandeliers had replaced the wooden tables shown in old photographs. Tourists came for Ambrose's braised short ribs, his smoked tomato soup, and the famous golden pepper pie served beneath a delicate crust. The menu described each dish as part of the Bellamy family legacy. Marlene had been preparing those recipes since she was 23. Her mother, Loretta Booker, had prepared them before her. Her grandmother, Estelle Booker, had cooked beside Ambrose during the restaurant's earliest years. Family photographs showed Estelle standing in the background with an apron tied over her dress, while Ambrose stood in front wearing a white jacket and holding dishes Estelle had taught him to make. The Bellamys called her their first kitchen maid. Marlene's mother called her the reason the doors stayed open. After the anniversary dinner, Marlene remained downstairs to supervise cleanup. The younger cook scrubbed pans while pastry chef Nia Wells labeled leftovers. Near midnight, Graham's longtime butler, Theodore Finch, entered the kitchen carrying a small mahogany box. Theodore was 70, thin and formal, with silver hair and the tired dignity of a man who had spent 40 years watching the Bellamys confuse discretion with loyalty. "Mr. Bellamy wants to see you," he said. "Which one?" Marlene asked. "The one who still remembers what you have done for this family." Graham waited in his private office overlooking the courtyard. His wheelchair stood beside an old oak desk. He struggled to lift his hand when Marlene entered. Theodore placed the mahogany box between them and left. Graham spoke slowly. "Adrian was wrong." "Adrian was honest," Marlene replied. "He said what the family has always believed." Graham closed his eyes briefly. "Not me." "You heard him." "I couldn't. You could have stopped him with one word." Graham's damaged hand tightened against the armrest. "Sorry." Marlene had known him too long to mistake regret for change. "Why did you call me?" Graham pushed the box toward her. Inside was a thick leather-bound book with cracked brown edges. Marlene recognized it immediately. It was the original Bellamy recipe book, displayed for decades in a glass case at the company's headquarters before disappearing after Graham's stroke. The cover bore the initials AB in faded gold. Adrian said this was sent for restoration, Marlene said. Graham shook his head. He wanted burned. She looked up. Why? Graham pointed toward the book. Read. The first pages contained recipes written in Ambrose Bellamy's elegant handwriting. But halfway through the book, the writing changed. The letters became rounder, firmer, and familiar. Marlene had seen that handwriting on birthday cards saved by her mother. It belonged to Estelle Booker. Her grandmother's name appeared at the top of a page dated June 1925. Estelle's pepper and corn pie. Beneath it was the recipe now served as the Bellamy golden pepper pie. Other pages followed. Estelle's Sunday beef, Estelle's smoked tomato broth, Estelle's brown sugar custard. Beside each recipe, Ambrose had made notes. Customers loved this. Estelle corrected the seasoning, never change her method. Marlene turned the pages faster. The book contained more than recipes. There were expense records, supplier lists, handwritten agreements, and letters between Ambrose and Estelle. One entry from 1927 said the restaurant had failed to pay rent for 3 months. Estelle sold a piece of land inherited from her father and used the money to settle the debt. Another entry showed that she purchased the restaurant's first industrial stove. A signed agreement promised her 40% ownership of Bellamy House and equal rights to every recipe she created. This cannot be the only copy, Marlene said. Graham shook his head. There were contracts. Adrian found references during the company audit. And he wanted the book destroyed. Graham nodded. Expansion loan, investors, if ownership challenged. The company's value collapses. Not collapses, he said. Changes hands. Marlene read a letter dated 1941. Ambrose wrote to Estelle after she became ill. He promised that her share would pass to her daughter, Marlene's grandmother's only child. But a later transfer document showed Estelle surrendering all ownership for $500. Her signature looked wrong. Graham slid a forensic handwriting report across the desk. It concluded the signature was forged. Who knew? Marlene asked. My father, his attorney, later me. Her stare hardened. How long have you known? Graham's voice nearly disappeared. 17 years. Marlene closed the book. For 17 years, Graham had praised her dedication at staff dinners while knowing her family had been cheated out of the company. He had promoted her to executive kitchen director but never allowed her name to appear on menus. He had told journalists the recipes came from his grandfather's genius while standing beside evidence that Estelle created them. Why tell me now? She asked. Graham looked toward the door. Because Adrian will destroy everything after I die. And you're frightened he'll ruin the company. I'm frightened he'll erase her again. Marlene stood. You helped erase her. Graham lowered his eyes. Yes. The next morning, Adrian summoned Marlene to the headquarters conference room. Vivian sat beside him with company attorney Grant Leland. Penelope remained near the window, though she held no position in the business. Adrian placed a termination agreement on the table. After last night, we believe it's time for a leadership change in the kitchens. Marlene sat without touching the papers. Because I embarrassed you. Because you have difficulty respecting boundaries. The food was served correctly. The guests were satisfied. This isn't about food. It rarely is with your family. Vivian leaned forward. We are offering 18 months of salary, full pension protection, and a generous confidentiality payment. Confidentiality concerning what? Grant answered. Recipes, internal procedures, family correspondence, and any historical documents you may have accessed during your employment. Marlene looked at Adrian. You're worried your father showed me the book. His expression changed. Vivian looked toward him. What book? Adrian ignored her. Anything removed from company property belongs to Bellamy Dining Group. The original book belongs to the person who wrote it. Ambrose Bellamy wrote it. Not all of it. Penelope laughed softly. This is becoming ridiculous. Are we really negotiating with the cook? Marlene turned toward her. A cook built the empire you plan to marry into. Adrian struck the table with his palm. Enough. Sign the agreement and leave with dignity. Marlene rose. My dignity is the one thing your family never had the authority to give me. She left the termination papers where they were. Graham had already contacted an independent attorney named Simone Clark. Simone specialized in intellectual property and historical ownership disputes. When Marlene brought her the recipe book, Simone spent 3 hours examining every page. This is not merely family history, she said. It is evidence of ownership, authorship, fraud, and unpaid licensing. Bellamy Dining Group had earned hundreds of millions by selling Estelle's recipes through restaurants, cookbooks, frozen foods, and branded sauces. If the agreement was valid and the later transfer forged, Estelle's ownership share had passed through her descendants to Marlene. What do you want? Simone asked. Marlene thought about Adrian calling her a servant, Graham remaining silent for 17 years, and her mother dying believing Estelle had been only an employee. I want my grandmother's name restored. That is the moral answer. I am asking for the legal one. Then I want everything her name should have protected. Simone filed an emergency preservation request preventing Bellamy Dining Group from destroying recipe archives, contracts, financial records, or historical marketing materials. Adrian responded publicly, claiming a former employee had stolen a sentimental family artifact and was attempting to exploit Graham's illness. Reporters gathered outside Marlene's modest house. Anonymous company sources described her as bitter after being passed over for executive leadership. Adrian appeared on television with the recipe book's empty display case behind him and said, "Our family has always treated Ms. Booker with generosity." That sentence changed the case. Former Bellamy employees began contacting Simone. A retired bookkeeper had copies of royalty statements showing payments once labeled E. Booker recipe share before being reclassified as family development expenses. A former archivist remembered being ordered to remove Estelle's name from early menus. A 90-year-old waiter produced a photograph of Ambrose standing beneath a sign that read, Bellamy and Booker Dining Room. The right side of the sign had later been cropped from company publications. Theodore provided the most important evidence. He had worked for Graham's father and knew where old records were hidden. Beneath the wine cellar floor, inside a sealed metal cabinet, he found the original 1927 partnership contract. It named Ambrose Bellamy and Estelle Booker as co-owners. Estelle held 40% of the restaurant, all rights to recipes created in her hand, and a permanent share of income from future locations using those recipes. Her authentic signature matched the recipe book. The forged transfer had been filed 6 months after her death, when she could not possibly have signed it. Graham gave a sworn video statement admitting his father told him about the forgery. He confessed that he remained silent because the family feared losing control of the company. Marlene did not manipulate me, he said. Her family was manipulated by mine for generations. Vivian visited Marlene privately after seeing the evidence. Unlike Adrian, she had not known the truth. I believed the recipes were ours, she said. They are yours in the sense that your family ate from them, Marlene replied. That is not the same as creating them. Vivian looked around Marlene's kitchen. Framed photographs of Loretta and Estelle stood on a shelf beside jars of spices. Why did your mother never challenge us? Because she did not have the book, the contract, or money for lawyers. She had stories, and wealthy families are very good at calling other people's stories rumors. Vivian lowered her eyes. What will happen to the restaurants? That depends on whether your brother wants to protect the business or the lie. Adrian chose the lie. He challenged the partnership contract, claimed Estelle had been paid as an employee, and argued that all recipes created inside Bellamy House belonged to the company. Simone introduced menus printed before the company existed formally, listing Estelle's name beside the dishes. A food historian testified that several recipes came from Booker family traditions and appeared in Estelle's handwritten church cookbook years before Ambrose claimed to create them. Financial experts traced the growth of Bellamy House directly to her food. The golden pepper pie alone had generated more than $80 million in branded sales. When Adrian testified, Simone asked whether he had ever prepared the dish. He admitted he had not. "Can you name its principal spices?" she asked. "The recipe is confidential." "You called it your family recipe." Adrian stared at her. "It is." "Then tell the court how your family makes it." He could not. The case ended before a jury reached a verdict. Bellamy's investors threatened to withdraw unless the family settled. Banks froze the expansion loan. Restaurant employees protested after learning that Adrian planned to close 3 locations to fund the lawsuit. Vivian joined Graham in supporting Marlene's claim. Grant Leland advised Adrian that continuing could expose the family to fraud charges. The settlement restored Estelle Booker's 40% ownership interest, paid decades of unpaid licensing revenue, and transferred control of the recipe division to Marlene. Adrian retained part of the hospitality company but lost authority over menus, branding, and culinary operations. Graham resigned as chairman. Vivian became interim chief executive under an independent board. Adrian left after shareholders discovered he had ordered digital archives deleted shortly before the court preservation order. Marlene did not close the restaurants. Thousands of employees had built lives around them, and destroying their jobs would not restore Estelle's dignity. Instead, she changed the name of the original restaurant. The gold letters above the entrance were removed after 100 years. In their place appeared a new sign, Booker and Bellamy House, established 1924. Inside, the menu credited every original dish properly: Estelle Booker's golden pepper pie, Estelle's smoked tomato broth, Loretta Booker's Sunday peach cake. Marlene added her own recipes but refused to hide the cooks who developed them. Every menu included the names of the kitchen team. "Food does not appear because an owner signs a check," she told the staff. "Someone thinks, tastes, burns, begins again, and makes it worth serving." The original recipe book was placed in a protected glass case near the dining room entrance. It remained open to the page bearing Estelle's name. Beside it stood the partnership contract and the uncropped photograph of both founders. Visitors often stopped to read the display before eating. Some arrived because of the scandal. Most returned because the food remained good. Graham visited 6 months after the settlement. His health had declined, and Theodore pushed his wheelchair into the restaurant before opening hours. Marlene met them near the old kitchen door. Graham looked up at the new sign visible through the window. "You kept Bellamy," he said slowly. "Ambrose helped build it." After what his family did. Correcting history does not require replacing one erasure with another. Graham's eyes filled. "Can you forgive me?" Marlene studied the man who had known the truth for 17 years. "I can understand why you were afraid." He waited. "That is not the same as forgiveness," she added. Graham nodded. For once, he did not ask her to make his regret easier. 1 year later, Booker and Bellamy opened a culinary school in the building where Estelle once rented a single room. Scholarships were reserved for cooks whose work had been used without credit or opportunity. Theodore served on the school's history committee. Vivian funded an archive documenting overlooked restaurant workers. Nia Wells became executive pastry chef across the company. Marlene remained head of culinary development but still cooked at the original location every Friday. She said leadership should never place a person so far from the kitchen that they forgot what the company actually sold. On the anniversary of Estelle's birth, Marlene prepared the golden pepper pie herself. Young cooks gathered around as she rolled the dough and explained why the peppers had to rest before being folded into the filling. One student asked whether the recipe was secret. Marlene smiled. "The method is protected. The history is not." She placed the pie in the oven and looked through the glass door as the crust began to rise. For generations, the Bellamys had called the black woman in their kitchen a servant because that word made the family story easier to own. They believed Estelle's labor belonged to the room where she performed it, and that her recipes became theirs the moment wealthy customers praised them. But the old book preserved what their public history tried to erase. Estelle Booker had not merely cooked for Bellamy House. She invested in it, saved it from closing, created the dishes that made it famous, and built the foundation of an empire that refused to carry her name. Marlene did not take the Bellamy legacy away. She returned the missing half and made sure no cook in those kitchens would ever again be treated as invisible while someone else took credit for what they created.